Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be talking to you about PFAS in pesticides. Next, please. What are PFAS? I'm going to start by telling you what PFAS are, why they're dangerous, why they're important, and then we're going to talk about why they might be in pesticides and what we've found. So what are PFAS? It's a really good question. It's an acronym for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's basically a very large group of chemicals, over 9,000 according to EPA, that all share a very strong carbon-fluorine backbone. And the bond between carbon atoms and fluorine atoms are one of the strongest known to humans. So they're very, very difficult to break. PFAS are ubiquitous. They have been used for decades, and we're only just recently learning about how dangerous they are. There's no standard definition in the United States for what a PFAS is, but EPA now has a working definition, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And unfortunately, states and the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international standard-setting agency that the US is a part of, we're a member state of the OECD, they are using different definitions. There's actually a bill in Congress right now to use the same definition as the states, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. All PFAS are persistent, many are bioaccumulative, and many, possibly all, are toxic. Next. So how do the definitions differ? I am not a chemist, and PFAS chemistry is extremely complex. So even though this slide looks a little scary, we're not going to go into detail. You're not going to have to dredge up your high school chemistry here. EPA's working definition basically requires two fluorine carbons attached to each other, possibly three, depending on what we're looking at. With these carbons and the fluorine bonds together, OECD defines it as one fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon atom with a few exceptions. And the states and the new bill that just came in end of November to the US Congress suggests that it should be defined as a substance with one fully fluorinated carbon atom. Very simple, it's broad. It might capture some things that aren't quite as toxic as others, but it's simple, easy to use, and probably the best definition. Next. Why is this definition important? Well, part of the reason is that there's a lot of misinformation out there about which PFAS are being used, which are dangerous, which aren't dangerous. The industry tends to say that only the C8s, those PFAS that have 8 carbons, are dangerous. And you probably have heard of PFOA and PFOS. Those are the two most notorious PFAS, and there's movies about them, such as Dark Waters, The Devil We Know, but other PFAS are just as dangerous. So there's a lot of misinformation, and we need to get that definition succinct and easy to understand. There are, as I said, 9,252 of these PFAS substances. Regulating them one at a time, what we call the whack-a-mole approach, will take too long. It will take centuries, and we don't have that time because PFAS is actually a national health crisis. We have toxicity information on relatively few of them. Next. This is a great website on the toxicity of PFAS, and there are only like 29, I think, of them here that we have toxicity information. You can see that the green are studies on humans, and then we have also animal studies and in vitro studies in in petri dishes. So we have very little toxicity information given that we have over 9,000 of them, but as you can see, we have toxicity on all of them that we have studied. Next. So I want to talk a little bit about the history of PFAS before we get into why PFAS are in pesticides. We've been waiting a long time for federal regulation of the two C8s, PFOA and PFOS. These were developed in a lab in the 1940s, and it wasn't until 1998 that 3M, one of the big companies that makes PFAS, told EPA that PFOS actually builds up in human blood and causes liver damage in rats. In 1999, EPA audited some of their studies, and in 2001, attorney Rob Bilott, who was brought on to help a town in West Virginia whose water was poisoned with PFOA. Rob provided EPA with a bunch of documents that he got in the course of his litigation. And also in 2001, 3M gave EPA even more evidence of toxicity of PFOS. In 2005, EPA actually fined DuPont, another manufacturer of PFAS, over $10 million for failing to report substantial risk of injury to human health. Next. In 2006, EPA started a voluntary stewardship program with 3M, DuPont, and 6 other major manufacturers of PFOA and PFOS. Basically, they voluntarily agreed to stop making it in this country. They did not agree to stop importing it or using it, and some of the smaller manufacturers were still allowed to make it in the US. So when people say PFOA and PFOS are banned in the US, they're not. EPA also said in 2006 that it is not aware of any human health impacts. And yet at the same time, they told the public that it is safe to use products with PFAS. Go ahead, next slide. EPA's Scientific Advisory Board said that PFOA in the same year, in 2006, said it's a likely human carcinogen. In 2009, EPA published a provisional health advisory for PFOA and PFOS of 200 parts per trillion. This stuff is so toxic that we're measuring it in the parts per trillion, and the state of California is even considering regulating it in the parts per quadrillion. EPA issued its first action plan and stated that it intends to consider initiating a TSCA Section 6 rulemaking for managing some of these C8 substances. They were very concerned about it. Next. In 2012, EPA issued an unregulated contaminant monitoring rule requiring testing of 6 PFAS across the country. And they found, even though the detection limits were quite high, they found that it was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. In 2016, EPA set a lifetime health advisory for those 2 PFAS, just 2 of them, PFOA and PFOS, of 70 parts per trillion. So it went down from 200 parts per trillion down to 70. In 2019, under the Trump administration, EPA released its second PFAS action plan, promising to regulate PFOA and PFOS in drinking water by the end of the year. It did not happen. Next. In the fall of 2021, the Biden administration released a PFAS roadmap. It just came out a few weeks ago. And they also promised to propose regulating PFOA and PFOS in drinking water by the end of 2022. So we've been waiting for a very long time for this federal regulation. It has not come yet. The states are filling in that void. States are starting to regulate it. Here in Massachusetts, where I live, we regulate 6 PFAS at 20 parts per trillion, far lower than what the federal lifetime health advisory is. However, one piece of good news coming out of EPA is that they've done recent risk assessments. They've reassessed PFOA, PFOS, and another PFAS called Gen X, saying that they're highly toxic, likely carcinogens, and the levels are much, much lower than their lifetime health advisory. Next, please. Why does it matter? Why do we care whether it's regulated? We care. Chemours is one of the companies that regulates PFAS, and this is actually a billboard outside one of their factories, which says, let's change the formula. And that's what happens. Whenever a state starts to regulate one of these PFAS, these companies just create another one. They tweak it a little bit and create another one that's not regulated, which means we have to regulate all of these PFAS as a class of chemicals, a large class, but a class, because otherwise we are going to continue with this whack-a-mole approach and we will never be able to regulate them all, and it's going to put our health at risk. Next slide, please. So we're now at PFAS and pesticides. The reason PFAS is such a hot topic these days is because it is linked to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid problems, behavioral problems, gestational diabetes, obesity, all sorts of problems. Very, very scary set of symptoms associated with high PFAS levels in your blood, including now something that's very critically important is the fact that it makes vaccines not work very well, and it also makes you more susceptible to severe cases of COVID. So I started noticing this. This is a map of the state of Massachusetts, if you don't recognize it. And these red towns are the ones that have high PFAS in their wells. And I know why some of these towns in the kind of the right central part of the state, you see a cluster of towns. That's where there's an Air Force base. And you often find PFAS at military bases because it's in the firefighting foam. But down in the southeast coast of Massachusetts, not Cape Cod, because there's another Air Force base there, but in the rest of those towns, I was wondering, what do they all have in common? There's no Air Force bases there. There's no industry there that would be manufacturing this stuff, no firefighting training facilities. The only thing I could think of that these towns had in common was that they are all aerially sprayed with a pesticide called Anvil 1010. Next. So I asked EPA, I asked DEP in Massachusetts if Anvil had PFAS in it, and they said, no, no way. They asked EPA, EPA said, no, absolutely not. I didn't believe it because I just had to check for myself. So we tested Anvil 1010, and we found these 5 PFAS in the Anvil. Next. Why is PFAS in Anvil 1010? Well, when I talk to scientists who are familiar with both pesticides and PFAS, they tell me that PFAS can be very handy in pesticides. It's a great surfactant. In other words, when you spray a pesticide, you want it to get an even layer over all of the vegetation or whatever it is that you're spraying, your carpets or whatever you're trying to spray to put pesticides on. So it makes it a very even application. So it makes it disperse. It's a great surfactant. So they thought, well, yeah, people could be deliberately putting PFAS in these pesticides. So given the amounts that we were finding, which were in the couple hundred to couple thousand parts per trillion, it could indeed be contamination. And indeed, that's what EPA found. When EPA heard our results, they themselves tested the Anvil, and they also found PFAS in Anvil. But what they said was that it was coming from the plastic barrels, the HDPE barrels used to transport and store the Anvil. And they were highly fluorinated. So they had PFAS in them in the parts per billion. And this stuff was leaching out into the pesticide and then being sprayed everywhere. Next. Why else might PFAS be in pesticides? I have no reason to doubt that the Anvil, the reason PFAS was in Anvil is because of contamination from the barrels, but also EPA allows PFAS as inert ingredients in pesticides and also as active ingredients in pesticides. Next. If you go to EPA's inert finder, you'll see that there are 19 chemicals that are highly fluorinated on their list of approved inert ingredients for pesticides. Not all 19 of these are PFAS, but I believe around 17 of them are. So EPA tells me that these are all legacy and that nobody uses them anymore, but they are allowed and they're on their list. Next. We've also found that PFAS is used as an active ingredient in pesticides. These 3 are used not in the US, they've been banned in the US, which is great, but they're still used in South America, Japan, and in China. Next. What about in the US? Do we have pesticides that contain PFAS as active ingredients? It depends on how you define them, but if you use the state's definition or OECD's definition, indeed, we have a number of pesticides that have PFAS as active ingredients, and here are a list of them. There's 2 products that are used for termites, 24 products, including those mosquito coils that people sit and put it on their table outside and breathe. It's in a number of other insecticide products and also in a fungicide product. So these are approved pesticides, approved by EPA, approved by many, many states that have PFAS as active ingredients. Next. So we did some more testing. We tested with the Maryland Pesticide Education Network, and we tested Permanone 3030. And disturbingly, we found a lot of PFAS in that one. We also found it in 2 herbicides that are sold over the counter at your local Home Depot or Lowe's or Ace Hardware. And we found it in Seresto collars, which are problematic for other reasons, and also frontline flea and tick products, so in pet products. Next. So the Permanone, our finding with Maryland Pesticide Education Network on Permanone EPA also tested that. And originally they confirmed our findings and found PFAS and Permanone. But the problem is that pesticides are very oily, usually. Not some of them are granular, but most of them are an oily liquid. And EPA did not have a test that was adequate for oily matrices. So they just recently, at the end of September, I believe, developed a draft test for oily matrices like pesticides. They retested Permanone, and their new test showed no PFAS. So they thought that perhaps some of the tests that were approved prior to this draft test were giving us false positives. So they found no PFAS in Permanone. However, we do know, PEER does know, and the Maryland Pesticide Education Network knows, that there are PFAS in a number of pesticides. We don't know about Permanone because the EPA is questioning it now. We're not sure. We do know it's in a multitude of pesticides, in a plethora of them, as either inert or active ingredients, and perhaps also additional contamination from other storage containers. Next. Why is this a problem? This is a graphic about the life cycle of PFAS. So PFAS, you can get a PFAS exposure from 3 routes: inhalation, ingestion through water or food, and also through dermal absorption. And it's almost impossible to destroy. If you remember back in the beginning of this talk, I talked about how strong that carbon-fluorine bond is. Well, because it's so hard to destroy, if you burn PFAS, if you put it in an incinerator, it becomes airborne, can travel up to 150 kilometers, and then sink to the ground and get in drinking water. If you put it through a wastewater treatment plant, it actually increases the amount of PFAS, because PFAS are notorious for recombining. They break down a little bit and then recombine and form other PFAS, particularly some of the really concerning ones like PFOA and PTOS. So there's this whole life cycle of PFAS. And if we're also spraying it from airplanes and helicopters and trucks into our atmosphere to get into the water and into the soil, that's just another avenue that creates this massive contamination across the country. Next. So the points I really want to get across to you here is that PFAS must be regulated as a class. There are some bills in Congress talking about that. The states are doing it, not all of them, but Maine just passed a pretty comprehensive law that regulates all PFAS as a class and bans it in a number of things. They're trying to phase it out in the entire state. Massachusetts is headed that direction. California is headed that direction. A number of states are going this way. The federal government really needs to do the same thing, so we have a level playing field across the country, because as you know, pollution does not recognize political boundaries. So if a state that bans PFAS and defines it properly is adjacent to a state that doesn't regulate it at all, that state that is trying to do the right thing is still going to be contaminated, because water and air will come in from the state that doesn't regulate it. So PFAS need to be regulated as a class because there are far too many, over 9,000. They all share that carbon-fluorine bond, which is almost impossible to break. It's so hard to break that EPA even put out a reward, a $50,000 reward, asking if people could figure out a way to break it, they would pay them money. That reward was awarded. People are finding ways to break that bond and destroy PFAS at what we call on the bench, so at a lab on a very small level. But we're having great difficulty transferring that ability to break that bond on a large scale. And we need to do it on a large scale because manufacturers are emitting millions of gallons of PFAS contaminated waste every day. All PFAS are persistent, many are bioaccumulative, many, if not all, are toxic, and regulating them one by one will take us hundreds and hundreds of years. Next. PFAS also must be taken out of pesticides. They just have to. We cannot have them as contamination, and EPA is trying to get a handle on that. They've asked companies to come forward if they're using those fluorinated HDPE barrels. So they're trying to get rid of the contamination issue. What they have not yet tackled is the inert ingredient and the active ingredient issues. And both of those are huge. There are numerous products on the shelves that have PFAS and people don't know because it's not in the label. So Pure believes that we must use the precautionary principle when we're talking about PFAS in pesticides. And what the precautionary principle says is we must adopt precautionary measures when we have scientific evidence about an environmental or human health hazard. And if it's uncertain and the stakes are high, err on the side of taking precautions. And that's what we want to do here. If we invoke the precautionary principle, we would be regulating PFAS as a large class with a very simple definition of one fully fluorinated carbon. We would ban all non-essential uses. And I put forth the premise that there is no essential reason for having PFAS in any pesticides. In fact, I would say that pesticides should be used far more sparingly than they are being used today. They cause great harm. There's an insect apocalypse. They hit non-target insects. They are harming human health. And we really should not be using nearly as many pesticides as we use. In the state of Massachusetts alone, there's something like 16,000 registered pesticide products. We don't need that many. We don't need to be using them. People can take personal protection for mosquitoes. There are so many things we could do if we restore habitats. Ecological systems are meant to keep mosquito populations in control, for example. And part of the problem is that we're going to be getting a lot more disease moving into areas where they weren't before because of climate change. So we're going to get more warm weather mosquito diseases, for example, or insects that are problems for crops moving farther north. And yes, we're going to have to do something about that, but we cannot poison our way out of this. And pesticides are bad enough without having PFAS in them as well. So we're calling on EPA to regulate PFAS as a class and eliminate them entirely from all pesticides. Next. As Rachel Carson said so eloquently, if we are going to live so intimately with these chemicals, eating and drinking them, taking them into the very marrow of our bones, we had better know something about their nature and their power. And the bottom line is that we know neither. We're finding out now how powerful and how destructive pesticides are, but we don't even know when you go into a store and purchase a pesticide, or when you call someone to come, you call an exterminator, you have no idea what is in that pesticide that you're spraying outside your home, inside your home, what's being sprayed on your crops, what's being sprayed on your lawn by your lawn care guys. You have no idea. And the reason you have no idea is that it's not required for these companies to put this on the ingredient list. So we need to stop that. Again, we cannot poison our way out of this. We have to get PFAS out of pesticides. Next. The last slide is just my contact information if anyone wants to get in touch with me, and I will be available to answer questions. Thank you so much.